Greetings everyone, Brett here with Hammerhead Model Making, and welcome to the first episode in a multi-part series that I'm going to be doing on the infamous Ye Olde Pub incident. If you're not familiar with this story, over the course of the next few episodes, I'm going to parse out the details and give you an idea of what transpired here. And this is a kit this is a project that I have been passionate about doing ever since I first heard the story about 3 years ago. And I've spent the last 3 years researching, preparing, gathering all the materials and the things that I would need for this project. And it's going to be an ambitious project. And my very first intention was to do this project in 1/72nd scale. But as I was doing my research and trying to figure out how I wanted to represent this moment in time, I realized that I would need to do this in a larger scale. That kind of left me with two options. I could do it in 1/48 scale or I could do it in 1/32nd scale. I settled on 1/48 scale as a good medium between size and detail, but also knowing the fact that this was going to take up a lot of space when it was done. So yeah, I'm so thrilled to be able to begin this series and show this off for you. And so this episode is going to cover the construction and painting of Franz Stigler's BF 109G-6. And so this episode will largely feel like a normal full build video, as I'll be going through that whole process for Stigler's 109. If you were paying attention to the opening credits, you'll also notice that we're going to have a guest narrator on this episode. And if you've ever watched one of my older videos, the video about the Pearl Harbor P-40, my father was a guest narrator in that episode, and he is returning for this video series. And so I'm going to concentrate on talking and narrating about the actual build itself, while my father will provide some backstory and insight into the actual incident itself. So we will hear from him a little bit later on in the video, as well as subsequent videos in this series. Now, I have a build video of this aircraft, this kit specifically, the Eduard 1/48 scale BF 109G6, and so if you've seen that video, you're going to see some things in here that are familiar, but what I'm really hoping that you'll take away from this video is the kind of zeroing in on the aspect of what I'm trying to create here is a very specific moment in time, as opposed to just a normal build where I'm building an aircraft, a vehicle, or whatever, in kind of like a vacuum, as it were. And so my vision for this project was to portray both aircraft. So there's two aircraft in this display. There's Franz Stigler's BF 109 here, and then there's going to be Charlie Brown's B-17. And there's a very specific moment in time where they were flying in formation together. And that's the moment that I wanted to capture. And in order to achieve my vision of that moment, one of the very important things specifically to this particular build is capturing the pilot, Franz Stigler, in a very specific moment. So I'm using a combination of figures from other kits, and I'm sure people who are very savvy and very knowledgeable about German uniforms will quickly notice that I am not using a German figure. I had surprisingly a difficult time trying to find a seated German BF-109 pilot. And so I decided, since the BF-109 cockpit is so small and cramped, that once I get the figure in there and I get everything closed up and I get the canopy on, you're really not going to see a whole lot of the actual figure himself. So I'm using a combination of a British fighter pilot and parts from an American fighter pilot, as well as some resin hands, because I wanted to get some very specific gestures with the hand. So the beginning portion of this video has seen me modifying a figure to be able to sit in the cockpit and look and feel like they're sitting in there naturally. And you'll notice earlier in the video that I had to kind of do a little bit of surgery on the figure in order to get them to fit in correctly. Right now, I have the arms I've left off because I want to get the figure situated in the cockpit, so that then I can start manipulating the arms and get them into the positions and poses that I want. I also used a head from a different figure, as to me, it looked better and more closely resembled something like a German fighter pilot would be wearing. And then I was able to position it in a way that, for the overall project, is the Franz Stigler will be looking out the left side of his cockpit towards where the B-17 is going to be, and he's going to be making some gestures at it. And there's a couple of moments in the story where he's trying to get the attention of the B-17 crew, and so that's roughly what I'm trying to go for here. And one of the tricky parts here was making sure that I could get his left arm, so he's going to be trying to get the attention of the B-17 with his right arm. So with his left arm, I needed him holding the control stick of the aircraft. And so it was a little back and forth trying to get the pose right, trying to get the angles right, and modifying the figures. For assembling this figure, I am using the UV curing resin. That's why you see that UV light that I keep putting on there. I'm not using super glue. I'm not using plastic cement. The reason why I'm using the UV curing glue, or not, it's technically not glue, it's just resin, is because I could quickly affix it, but if I needed to change something, it was relatively easy to pop off, clean off the resin, and then start over without damaging the plastic at all. And it was an easy way to prototype and figure out how I wanted this to fit. Now, another consideration is, because the canopy does sit pretty low, I had to make sure his hand wasn't going to hit the top of the canopy and, somehow get in the way. So it took a little while, but I was finally pleased with how the figure fit in the cockpit and how he was looking and how natural it was and how much you'd be able to see of him from the exterior of the aircraft. Now, this kit is one of their white box kits. It's known as an overtree kit. So if you're not familiar with an Eduard overtree kit, it is essentially just a plain box with just plastic in it. It doesn't come with decals. It doesn't come with instructions. It doesn't come with photo etch, masks, anything. It just comes with the plastic. And it comes at a considerable discount compared to like a Profi pack or even a weekend edition of the kit. And the idea is you go out and purchase one of the Eduard Profi packs, for example, and they usually come with 6 to 10 different paint schemes. And so the idea is you buy a Profi pack and then you buy a couple of overtree sets so that you can use some of those extra decals that you get. And obviously you would need to use the instructions from the original Profi pack, things like that. Fortunately, I do have a couple of the 109 kits in my stash, and so having instructions was not an issue. Additionally, because I am using aftermarket decals and paint masks for markings, I didn't need to worry about decals, and because I was doing the pilot inside the aircraft, I wasn't worried about like not having the photo etch instrument panel, things like that, just because I knew they would just never be seen. Same thing with like photo etch seat belts, for example. I'm just making my own here using some lead foil and wire so that I can have the restraints over the shoulder of the pilot. So, for instances like this, an overtrees kit is actually really nice and really handy. I mean, I would say 60%, reduced price from a normal Profi pack. So in my mind, it's a pretty good value. So if you buy like a Profi pack and then you can pretty much buy 2 sets of Overtrees and then maybe a set of masks if you wanted to for the same price of a Profi pack. And so in my mind, it makes sense. I think it's a good way of utilizing all the great marking schemes that Eduard usually gives you in their Profi packs. So right now I'm just attaching the harnesses, the scratch built harnesses that I made using some super glue. Attach it to the back deck of the cockpit there, and then I'll drape them over the pilot. I'm not too worried about doing like the lap belts, making sure they're all connected. Again, mainly just because I know that you'll never really be able to see in there. And just trying to guide the lead foil around. The nice thing about the lead foil is it does fold and drape quite naturally, considering the scale, and it makes for good seat belts, things like that. And another thing I should point out about this video is I built this aircraft about 7 months ago from the time of the release of this video. And so there's a lot of things that I didn't have when I built this that I'd have now. For example, if you've seen the recent F9F Panther video, I show off a product in there called Black Magic Metal. I didn't have that at the time that I did the 109, but in later episodes of this series, when I'm working on the B-17, you'll see that make an appearance. And that's just mainly because there's quite a large time difference between when I started this versus when I worked on and finished the B-17. Now, for painting the 109, I am using this Vallejo German aircraft paint set, which comes with a lot of the standard RLM colors, and makes it easy just to this is Stigler's 109 was a fairly prototypical BF-109 paint scheme for 1943, so nothing like extraordinarily out of the norm for this. Using interior gray here to paint all of the obviously interior of the cockpit, and over a primer of Mr. Surfer 1500 black. Goes down really nice, goes down really easy. Now we're just going to do a simple dry brush. I'm not going to go overboard on all the details for this interior. Again, for the same reasons that all the other things, just because I know you're never going to really see any of it. Once the pilot's in there and the fuselage is closed up, you really don't see much below like the neck of the pilot. But doing a nice, stark dry brush will help any of those details that might be visible to kind of pop and stand out. The whole interior gets this dry brush, and including the pilot figure, because what it helps at least for me, what it helps with is seeing the details and finding the details in the figure, especially on like a solid matte black primer. It just makes it a little bit easier during the painting process. This is the fuel line that goes along the side of the cockpit here. We're going to paint some of the smaller details. Again, we're just using some Vallejo model color brush paints here to do our detail painting. And now normally on like the Profi Pack version of this kit, you'd have a lot of nice photo etch going into here, pre-color photo etch and things like that. But that's all largely hidden in the cockpit. I will be using the decal to do the instrument panel, and though I didn't have a lot of aspirations for it, it actually turns out pretty decent, I think, in my opinion. You'll see that just a little bit later on. I do like the use of color in the German cockpits. They had a tendency to color code various things like blue for oxygen, things like that, and it does help break up all of that just kind of drab gray color. Now we're going to move on to the pilot. I struggled finding good reference pictures of what like your prototypical 1943 German flight suit would look like. I found a few different pictures, so I'm sure there's going to be people out there that are going to tell me like, no, that's not quite right, and that's fair. But in the end, I kind of liked the way it looked, and I liked the idea of like the brown leather flying jacket and the blue uniform underneath, things like that. It just kind of worked for me, and so I'm definitely not a figure painter. So my figure painting skills here are going to be pretty rudimentary. Essentially, it's going to consist of, blocking in all of the solid colors and then doing a pretty heavy like wash over that to kind of pick out some of the details, and then maybe a little bit of slight dry brushing after the fact just to hit some of those highlights again. So pretty straightforward, pretty simple, nothing spectacular. But again, once it's all closed up, all you're going to really see is like his head, the top of his shoulders, and his hand, and that's about it. So I don't need it to look anything much more than that. Getting the leather helmet painted. Now we're going to do the belts, the seat belts here. Get those painted in kind of like a light gray color, which is nice because it helps kind of stand out against the uniform. So, yep, this is one of those things where like I enjoy the process, even though it's definitely not like my favorite thing to do. Figure painting is still a struggle for me, and even though I try to go and watch videos on YouTube about how the best way and easiest way to do figure painting, it's still just something that I struggle to really grasp and feel confident about. So here's that wash I was telling you about. This is just the Citadel Agrax Earth Shade wash. It works for me. Getting the fuel line installed here. Again, I like the splash of color in the cockpit. And here's the instrument panel I was telling you about. So I did give it a quick dry brush. Now I'm going to apply some Solvaset onto the part, and then I will apply the decal on top of that. The Solvaset is a pretty strong decal setting solution, and I've started applying it underneath the decal as kind of like a setting solution, or like a micro sol and micro set. I apply one before and then after. In this case, I just do the same thing before and after, but I found it helps with adhesion and really getting it to sink down into those around those details. So now we can kind of start dry fitting things in the cockpit, see how they look. The again, like I said, really tight in here, but definitely to me, it works and it looks the part. And it was really fun at this point, like getting it all painted, starting to get the fuselage put together, and having this moment where like the finished project flashed before my eyes, and it was like, okay, I'm on the right path. This is the direction that I'm going, the direction that I want to go, and it was an exciting moment, and I love when I'm working on a project and I have that moment where I can see the end result in my mind's eye, and know that I'm on the right track. That's always a fun moment. And I have that a few times throughout this project where I get that flash where it's like, okay, I'm liking where this is going. It's working, and I'm excited to see it. Because one of the fun things for me is I'll get to a point where I'm excited to see what happens next as I'm doing it. And it's kind of a fun feeling to get that, where like I get to actually be excited about whatever project I'm working on. And this is definitely one of those times, and I have it multiple times throughout this series. So right now I'm just getting the gun sight painted up so that we can get that installed, and we'll be able to work on closing up the fuselage and stuff. So here's the instrument panel again. I'm going to use a little bit of the UV curing resin on each of the dials just to kind of provide a nice little shiny face there. It's a fun little process that I like doing, and I like the look of it once it gets fit in there. It's interesting that like you fit the cockpit onto one side of the fuselage, you fit the instrument panel on the other side of the fuselage, but Eduard's done a good job with the engineering in it, and it fits pretty nicely. So there you can see just how tight it is in there. So moving on, we are going to take the fuselage, and we're going to start building it up and putting it together. Again, fit here on this kit. This is a phenomenal kit. It goes together really well. It's actually overall quite simple. You don't have a lot of options for this kit. Like the Tamiya BF 109G6, you can do like the engine open, closed. You can position the flaps, control surfaces, all those things. This kit has slightly fewer options, but that kind of helps make it build up a little bit faster and easier, in my opinion. And give you a nice, good result. So fuselage goes together. You can see I've got the tape there kind of holding everything together. There was a slight little bit of warpage on the front part of it, and I had to, really squeeze those together, but nothing that a little bit of tape couldn't overcome. Get the very front on here installed. You also notice that I pre-installed the exhaust earlier in the video. I just figured it'd be easier just to get those installed. I mean, you're supposed to install them at the beginning anyways, but worry about, painting those up later. And I'm just using the kit part there. There's no resin or anything in there, so they're not drilled out or anything. But honestly, I find that unless you're like really specifically looking for the drilled out exhaust, you're not really going to notice, because they kind of sit under these little shrouds that help direct the actual exhaust coming out. So that it's not like blowing up into the air intake or into the into the pilot's view, that kind of a thing. So you don't really see it all that well. So at this point, I am working on taking care of the seam lines, and fortunately, because of the engineering, there's really not a lot that you have to worry about. It's really around the nose, and that's kind of it. Because if you look at the way that Messerschmitt designed and built the 109s, and I believe this also works for the 110s as well, is they actually do, on the real aircraft, they do have a very small seam line running along the top and bottom of the back fuselage or the spine. And so it's correct to have a seam line up there. Now, you don't want to necessarily just leave just the two halves glued together and call that good. You do still have to do a little bit of sanding on the top of the spine to make sure that it's even and flush left to right, that kind of a thing. So it does require a little bit of work, but at least you don't have to worry about like completely removing that seam line altogether. Now, with all the sanding done and rescribing done, we're going to go ahead and re-rivet some of the areas that we sanded away the detail on, using this Galaxy riveting tool and the 0.65 wheel. Pretty much spot on match for the rivets already engraved on the kit itself. So it's pretty easy just to kind of line this up and apply a little bit of pressure and get those rivets restored. And again, there's not a lot of areas where we have to do the rivet restore. It's really just around those seam areas where we cleaned up the seams earlier on. So now we can begin installing a lot of the other extra bits and panels and details for the aircraft. We have this gun panel going on. Now, depending on, there's a lot of sub-variants of the Gustav series of 109s, and so there's different like gun panels, things like that you can, depending on which version you're doing, you'll need to pick the appropriate one. Again, as far as I understand, this was a fairly standard G6. As such, it has the openings for the two machine guns over the cowling. Getting the intake installed here, and that's a two-part affair. Get the upper tail on, get that installed, and I do like the little detail of this little strip here. So I guess this is part of the mechanism that helps like the engine covers hinge up. Just kind of a neat little detail that they have that separate. Moving on to the wings, we get all of the interior, of the landing gear installed. I do appreciate that these are all kind of separate parts. I think it helps with the detail a little bit more than just having it like molded in and simplifying the detail. With Eduard kits, they are designed to have the landing gear down. So you have to make modifications in order to portray the landing gear up, and especially on an aircraft like this where it's not just as simple as just closing over the hole with a door, because the landing gear door on the 109 only partially covers the wheel. It doesn't fully cover the wheel, so you do have to make sure that you have at least some of that detail that will be visible in there. But additionally, like you'll see in a little while what I mean, that there is additional modifications that will need to be made in order to get the landing gear to actually fit up inside the wing. Again, because it's not really designed for that, which is unfortunate, but I get it. Like, many people build their planes on the ground. And I'm finding myself now actually brainstorming more and more projects of in-flight aircraft. I mean, if you think about it, like, that's what they're meant to do. They're meant to be flying. So, who knows? I might be doing more of this in the future, more in-flight type displays. So now we can go ahead and get the upper wings installed. And again, a nice thing about these is the seam lines are kept to a minimum. And so there's not a ton of cleanup work that will have to be done, just a little bit on the front end, basically. We can go ahead and work on the horizontal stabilizers. These are 2 pieces. On many other kits, you might see those just as a single piece. Eduard has chosen to do them as a 2-part. But because of the fit, you really don't even need to worry about it all that much. They actually go together quite nicely. Get the elevators installed. These have a really short tab that kind of slots into the back of the horizontal stabilizer. So if you really wanted to, you could add a little bit of deflection to these without any modification. But all right, so here we're going to do the landing gear, and you can see here that the actual landing gear door doesn't fully sit down into the wheel well properly. So we're going to have to make some modifications, and that's basically just going to involve sanding away some of the material on the outside edges, which will allow it to sit into that wheel well a little bit better. And so I'm just using this jeweler's file to file away some of that, just a little bit of structure there, and that lets it sit in there much better, much more flush. Additionally, the tire is too thick to actually fully sit in the wheel well, so I had to thin that down almost by half in order to get that to sit in the wheel well properly. And there we go. We can get that in there. Now, in reality, there would be a strut attached to that wheel, which would also be attached to the landing gear door. Just for the sake of actually being able to make this fit, I omit the actual strut itself. So you just see the tire, you see the door over it. Technically not correct, but, in the interest of making it work and not have to thin that tire down to like 2 millimeter thickness, this was the better solution in my opinion. Also, not to mention that for the final display, you're not going to be really looking directly up underneath the aircraft to even notice. So compromises, but I think they make sense. All right, moving back to the fuselage, we're going to do the radiator underneath the engine here. Nice little multi-part piece going on. I do appreciate the way that this part fits in there so that you don't actually have to worry about sanding seams along that radiator part, which on older models is a pretty common thing and really annoying. So in just a few moments, I'm going to switch narration over to my father. And before I do that, I want to give you a little bit of backstory on this project. I first found out about this project 3 years ago, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, and purchased the book A Higher Call by Adam Makos. And his book and his narration and his style of storytelling is really what has provided the biggest source of inspiration for this project. And I asked my father to read the book and essentially give me his thoughts and in his words a summary of who these people were, Franz Stigler, Charlie Brown, and what happened. So his segment here is going to be talking about Franz Stigler and who he was and all the things, the events that led up in his life to this moment.
When most people hear the name Franz Stigler, they think of the remarkable story from December 1943, a German fighter ace who, instead of destroying a helpless American B-17 bomber, escorted it out of danger. It was one of the most extraordinary acts of mercy in the history of warfare. But if we stop the story there, we miss the deeper question, why? Why did Franz Stigler make that choice? What is in his life and character that led him, in the middle of the Second World War, to spare the lives of enemy airmen at great risk to himself? To answer that, we need to go back before the war, before the fateful day over Germany, to Franz Stigler's upbringing and his early life. Franz was born in 1915 in Rosenberg, Germany. He grew up in a devout Catholic family, raised with a strong sense of right and wrong. His father, a man both of faith and engineering skill, introduced Franz and his brothers to aviation at a time when flying still seemed miraculous. The Stiglers were not Nazis. This is an important point. Unlike many families in Germany who joined the party either out of enthusiasm or simply to gain social standing, the Stiglers quietly resisted. They never took the oath, never put the Nazi banner on their house. That decision came with risks. To refuse membership in the Nazi Party was to stand apart, to invite suspicion. But Franz's family lived by conscience, not by ideology. That integrity would mark Franz's path as well. Franz's passion from an early age was flight. He studied aviation not as a weapon of war, but as a craft. By the late 1930s, before the war began, he was working as a flight instructor for Lufthansa and the German Air Transport School. He trained civilian pilots. He loved the discipline of the air, navigation, engine mechanics, the skill of smooth takeoff and landings. When war broke out, Franz did not immediately rush to the front. In fact, he preferred flying in the civilian sphere. But like most trained aviators in Germany, he was drawn into the Luftwaffe. The war did not give him much choice. At first, Franz's work was not as a combat ace, but as an instructor for fighter pilots. His students would go on to fly the Messerschmitt Bf 109, the backbone of Germany's fighter force. But soon the demand for skilled pilots grew too great, and Franz himself was transferred into combat. He flew in North Africa, a campaign that tested pilots in some of the harshest conditions imaginable. He served under Hans Joachim Marcel, one of the most famous aces in the Luftwaffe. Marcel was extraordinary, not only for his flying skill, but for his character. He treated captured Allied pilots with respect and refused to let his men fire on parachuting enemies. To Marcel, the combat was the skill, not a cruelty. This philosophy left a deep impression on Franz. He began to see aerial combat not as a personal hatred of the enemy, but as a grim duty, something bound by rules of honor. Franz became an effective fighter pilot. He learned the brutal realities of war, dogfights that lasted seconds, friends who did not return from missions, the strain of constant danger. He scored victories in the sky, but he never revealed them. For Franz, every battle was a matter of survival, not triumph. By 1943, Franz had become a seasoned veteran. He was credited with dozens of kills, had faced the British and American pilots alike, and had seen the scale of destruction the war was unleashing on both sides. Germany by then was on the defensive, hammered by Allied bombing campaigns. The pressure on the Luftwaffe pilots was immense, shooting down bombers at all costs. But Stigler did not become hardened in the way that many of his peers did. The lessons of his upbringing, his family's quiet resistance to Nazism, his love of aviation, and his time under honorable leaders like Marcel shaped his conscience. It is important to remember that at this point in the war, the Nazi regime demanded not only obedience, but also ideological loyalty. Luftwaffe pilots were rewarded with medals, honors, and prestige for high kill counts, many celebrated as heroes of the Reich. But Franz never joined the Nazi Party. He never saw himself as fighting for Hitler's ideology. He was fighting because his country was at war, because his fellow pilots were in the air with him, because not flying was not an option. He often said later in life that he was not motivated by politics, but by duty and the bounds of comradeship. That made him unusual. In a system that demanded conformity, Franz carried a sense of independence. He was not blind to the horrors of the regime, nor was he indifferent to the suffering around him. And although he was a fighter ace, he did not think of his adversaries as nameless enemies. To him, they were men just like himself, risking their lives in the machine of war. By late 1943, Franz Stigler was stationed back in Europe. He was at a crossroads. He had survived the deserts of North Africa. He had trained countless young pilots, many of whom never came back. He had flown against some of the best the Allies had to offer. He had been shaped by mentors who emphasized honor and mercy, not brutality. And through it all, he had carried with him his family's example of moral courage, the quiet conviction that you do what's right, not what's easy. All of that, the Catholic upbringing, the refusal to embrace Nazism, the love of aviation, the hard lessons of combat, and the influence of Marcel came together to form the man he was in December 1943. So when he took off that day and saw a battered American bomber limping through the skies, when he moved behind it and had the chance to claim an easy victory, he was not simply a Luftwaffe ace at that moment. He was Franz Stigler, the son of a principled family, the pilot who loved flying for his own sake, the man who still believed in honor. And that was his choice. Though extraordinary, was not accidental. It was the natural outcome of a life he had lived up until that point. When we tell the story of Franz Stigler, it's easy to focus on the famous encounter with the B-17. But the real lesson lies in the years before. He had not become a man of compassion in an instant. He had been preparing for that moment all his life. Through the values he learned at home, the discipline of flying, and the example of leaders who showed him that even in war, humanity must not be abandoned. Franz Stigler reminds us that character is not forged in a single act, but it is over years tested in hardship and revealed in a moment of choice.
So when I originally set out to prepare for this project, one of the things that I knew that I would really need for this project was a set of painting masks, both for the B-17 and for the 109. I wanted to ensure that I could do the markings as good as possible. And to that end, I reached out to Kit Mask to help me and create a set of custom masks for this project. I am extremely grateful for them for dedicating so much time and energy to this project. And I definitely am going to attribute a large portion of the success of this project to them and being willing to work with me on this. So massive shout out to them. I'm going to leave their information down below in the description of the video and a link to their website. So painting markings is not necessarily an easy endeavor. The markings for this aircraft are fairly simple and straightforward, and I knew it would be a good way to practice that skill and but at the same time prepare me for doing the markings on the B-17. And the reason why that was important to me is because I knew that I would have to create areas of damage on the B-17 that would require having a marking over the damaged area. And I knew that trying to get a decal to conform over rough and jagged plastic was at best was going to be challenging. But I knew it'd be a little bit easier to paint that. And so I figured if I was going to paint the markings on the B-17, I might as well just paint the markings on the 109 as well. So that's what led to this. And I worked back and forth with Kitmask on, what's going to be the best way to achieve that and do that. So they were extremely helpful and collaborative in that process. And I know I've mentioned Kitmask multiple times on previous videos. I've used paint mask from them in multiple videos, and so far they've never let me down. So I absolutely highly recommend checking them out. They do canopy masks, they do paint masks, they do the works. And if this sounds like a paid advertisement, it's not. I do this because I appreciate the hard work that they put into their products and the fact that they work. So, sales pitch over. Head on over to their website, check them out. Like I mentioned before, the markings for this aircraft were fairly straightforward and simple, relatively simple to do. So something like this is a good opportunity to practice painting markings. Because it might allow you to do more complex paint schemes in the future, make things a little bit easier than having to worry about decals that don't conform well or don't fill into all the nice recesses and details of your model. These ones were a little tricky because you had to paint the yellow first and then carefully place a mask inside that so you'd have the outline. Some of them came out a little off kilter, but it's one of those things where for me that's good enough and close enough. And it was extremely satisfying to remove these masks and reveal that nice yellow with the black border. Very pleased with it. So there we go, markings painted. We can go ahead and do the wing walk markings. So this is using vinyl as opposed to like the Tamiya tape style. There's a little tedious to get this installed because you had to basically pull out all the little rectangles that you'd be spraying through, but it after a little bit of time, definitely worth the effort there. And then finally there's a little like first aid symbol that goes on the back here. You could spray this, but it was easier just to kind of stipple the paint on rather than get tons of paint loaded into the airbrush, only to spray a tiny little dot plus all the extra masking that require. So just know that you can stipple paint on with a brush with great effect here. And there you go, nice little first aid symbol. There are a few decals that I do need to use for this project, mainly just some of the small like unit badges and things like that would have been a little beyond my ability to paint. So to that end, we're going to go ahead and seal in everything that we've done so far on the build with a coat of Alclad Aqua Gloss. I am thinning this with Tamiya X20A, probably about 50%. I find it just helps spray better, spray a little bit easier, and allows me to lay it down a little bit thinner than if I was just spraying it directly out of the bottle, which in my opinion is a little overly thick. So this is going to twofold seal in all of our paintwork up to this point, including all those markings. We don't want to scratch those or have those ruined in any way. But it'll also give us a good, nice foundation for applying some of the decals on here. So another thing that's nice about doing an in-flight model is you kind of have a built-in painting stand. Makes things kind of easy. So we're going to go ahead and install the victory board here. As you can see here, Franz Stigler was quite an accomplished pilot and had a fair number of victories under his belt. Many of them were bombers. So he was no stranger to what he was doing. He was very accomplished at his job. And I think that impressive victory board kind of, stands in contrast to what he ends up doing. And reminds us that he wasn't a coward. He wasn't a slouch. Like, he knew what he was doing. Interesting to note. So I'm using Kit's World decals here for these markings, and you'll note that this badge that I'm putting on, I believe this is the City of Berlin badge or coat of arms, and you'll notice there's a bear on it. And the way that Kit World has done the decal is it's mirrored, so the bear is facing forward on both decals. However, after talking to some people from Germany, that is not correct, and the bear should always be facing to the left when you're looking at the emblem. So I kind of mulled over how I was going to correct that, because I wanted to make sure that was right. That's a fairly significant emblem and badge that has meaning to people, and I wanted to do it justice. And so I realized in the end I was just going to have to hand paint it. So I painted over the original bear in white and working on repainting it facing the correct direction. Far from perfect, but at an arm's length, you almost wouldn't be able to tell. And unless you're looking at like an actual picture of it next to the repainted emblem here, it'll look all right. So what I'm doing here is I have a small picture of the actual emblem, and then I'm constantly swapping the aircraft back and forth, just making sure that I'm getting close to it and as good as I can, touching up with a little bit of white paint here just to kind of clean up some of my lines and make sure the silhouette is close to correct. So once that's all done, then we're going to go ahead and gloss over the decals, seal those in, and that'll allow us to start doing some weathering over it. And I'm really glad that I repainted that emblem. I know it's a small detail, but it's one that was important for me to get correct. So next up, we're going to use my most favoritist wash in the world, the dark brown wash for green vehicles by Ammo MIG. And we're going to apply this liberally all over the aircraft. This is going to help us to make those panel lines, rivets, details pop on the aircraft. And it's a fairly simple product to use. So I apply it over the Alclad Aqua Gloss, which is an acrylic gloss varnish. And it works really well. I have not tried it over other types of gloss varnishes like enamels or lacquers. You're definitely not going to want to apply the wash over an enamel enamel varnish, because this is an enamel wash, and you'll probably end up ruining your varnish. I have used it with Vallejo acrylic varnishes with pretty good results as well. But essentially, you apply it on, you'll let it dry, which takes about 30 minutes depending on how thickly you applied it. And then because you applied over the gloss surface, you can just wipe away all the excess wash, and it'll leave the wash deposited in the panel lines, in the rivet details, and all that lovely surface detail. But you're wiping it away from all the flat surfaces on the exterior. And this is kind of like what I consider my first weathering pass, because this helps to create some contrast on the paint scheme, bring out those details, and it's kind of a little bit of like a grimy effect. Just shows a little bit of dirt buildup, that kind of thing. And right now I'm using Q-tips to get into some of the more hard to reach areas, some of the areas that just can't get to with the paper towel. So I use the paper towel for like 80 and 85% of the wash removal, and then do the Q-tips to really kind of hone in, clean up a lot of the stuff, and get it just right. You can also take advantage of maybe a little bit of streaking if you wanted to, using the wash, creating some general streaking along the flow of the airflow. That's up to you. I tend to remove as much as I can and do any kind of streaking later on with oils, but just to know that that is a possibility. So now we're going to knock down that shine, knock down that gloss coat with a satin coat. And this is going to be the actual final varnish for the aircraft. I will do additional weathering on top of that, but I'm not going to be doing any more varnishing after this point. This is going to be the final sheen of the aircraft. And I like using this Vallejo satin coat because it still gives a little bit of shine. That you can get some nice highlights kicking off some of the sharp edges, but it's not completely dead flat. And it's the right amount of shine, in my opinion. So at this point, we can start painting some of the smaller details like the exhaust, the gun barrels, things like that, and start doing some chipping. For this, I'm just using a little bit of essentially aluminum paint on a paintbrush and applying some very targeted chipping along the wing root area, where, the pilot would be getting on the aircraft to get in. Ground crew would be up there working on maintaining, loading, arming, that kind of thing. So you're going to get a little bit of wear and tear. At this point in the war, the 109s, the Luftwaffe would have had fairly decent supply lines, and their aircraft wouldn't have been filthy and destroyed and beat up at this point. Stigler did fly multiple 109s through his career, so this would have been a fairly new aircraft to him at this point. Going to do a little bit of sponge chipping on the leading edge of the wings, around the leading edges of the engine cowling, just very little. Do a little bit on the front of the spinner as well, and then the leading edges of the propellers. Sponge chipping is a great tool. It's pretty simple, pretty easy to do. The sponge that I'm using is basically like anytime I get a piece of aftermarket resin, it'll always come with a little bit of foam in there to help protect it in its shipping. So I just save it, hang on to it, cut it up into little rectangles, little squares, and that's what I use. For the exhaust, I'm going to do a little bit of additional painting here on it. This is just hitting it with some kind of like a rusty tone on the actual exhaust stubs, and then I'm going to give it a wash of Agrax Earthshade by Citadel. Basically the same wash that I used on the pilot. This just helps kind of add some cool brown variations to the exhaust. I really like this look, and I'll use this later on the B-17 as well to great effect. So now we're going to do a little bit of post shading. For this, I'm using a lacquer paint, and this is heavily thinned, probably 90% thinner. And you'll notice I didn't do any pre-shading on this build. When I'm doing a complex camo scheme, especially like on a German aircraft, I just find it easier to do post-shading rather than pre-shading. So here I'm just trying to, I'm not going to say randomly, but selectively darken some panel lines, some rivet lines, and help, again, add another layer of contrast and depth to the paintwork, as well as it does provide a little bit of dirt and grime and buildup around areas that you would typically find people working on, maintaining, things like that. I will also use the same paint to start doing the exhaust effect at the same very highly thinned ratio, so that I can really control how much exhaust that I'm building up and how it looks, where it's going, things like that. So it takes multiple layers, multiple coats, but that's okay. I appreciate, I'd rather have the control than, just trying to get it done in 1 or 2 passes, that kind of thing. Do a little bit of gun staining as well. He had actually been up on a mission just prior to taking off after the B-17. So decided to add a little, staining around the guns. Now we're going to add a little bit of light gray, neutral gray to the exhaust, just to help portray some of that, higher octane. Now they obviously weren't using the same as high octane as like the Allies were, for example, but it still helps to create this nice heat effect into the exhaust. I do like the 109 exhaust right there at the wing root. It's kind of a unique look and a fun place to practice. Now we're going to do a little bit of oil painting. And this is largely going to, I'm going to contain this to mostly like some streaking, some fluid leaking, hydraulic fluid, things like that around the aircraft. I'm not going to really heavily weather this aircraft, mainly because I didn't want that to be a focal point for the display. Was a super heavily weathered 109. Wanted a fairly straightforward not necessarily a clean aircraft, but a well-maintained aircraft. So overall weathering on this will be kept to a minimum. Just oil stains, oil leaks, things like that you'd typically find on a frontline aircraft, and we'll do a little bit of dirtying later on. So for this, again, we're just using the oil paint. We're just adding a tiny little dot of oil paint, and then using this wide flat brush that's loaded with thinner to pull it back, to streak it back, and create that flow along the airflow. Pretty simple, pretty effective, and fun to do. Next up, we're going to do a little bit of dry brushing and blending on the upper surfaces. Again, this is where you're going to have ground crew walking around. They're going to attract dirt and debris onto the aircraft. So just trying to blend that in. Normally, if I was doing it heavier, I would go with more of a wet blend. On this one, I'm kind of doing more of like a dry brush almost to get that blended in. Add a little bit of fluid leakage here and there, things like that. So at this point, pretty much all the weathering is done. We're going to go ahead and remove the canopy masks here, and this is always a satisfying, somewhat terrifying sometimes, but usually satisfying moment in the build. And that kind of means that we're going to start wrapping this up. So next up, we're going to work on the radio lines. And there was something I wanted to try for this. So when the radio wire is attached to the antenna and the rudder, there's a little insulator that goes on there. And I wanted to try and represent that. Now, it's going to be a little out of scale, slightly overscaled. And I'm fine with that. For me, it was something new that I wanted to try, a detail that I wanted to try adding, and ultimately I'm happy with the results. So I'm actually using some, essentially the tubing, the shrink wrap tubing that comes on your standard copper wire. I pulled the wire out and was able to thread in the radio wire around it. So now we're going to go ahead and get that attached to the mast. This is being attached with some super glue. So we're going to get that glued on, and you'll notice that I've left the insulators, in quotation marks, loose at this point. As I pull this thread tight and get it attached to the rudder, there's another wire gets attached to the fuselage here that'll eventually go up and attach to the main wire itself. And so at this point, I can get these insulators moved into position and glued in place. So it's just a matter of sliding these over, and you can see here I'm struggling to get this thing with the tweezers, and that's mainly because I was actually looking through the camera trying to do this as opposed to like looking at it directly. Made it a little challenging. Now we'll get the back one slid into place and glued, and they're not going to stay yellow. I will repaint them, but we can remove the excess wire here, and then we can get the secondary wire attached. So this is just going to get glued on as well. And the nice thing about this elastic wire is that pretty much once it's like glued on, it kind of locks in almost instantly to set. So we'll go ahead and get that trimmed. I was trying to be really careful here not to accidentally cut the main wire and have to start all over again, but you can see I got a little excess on there, so I'm using my single blade steady clippers there to try and trim that down and hopefully not cut the main wire. Another instance of I got it close enough. So there we go. All right, we're going to go ahead and finish painting a few details here. We're going to get this antenna painted here. And then we'll go ahead and paint the insulators a white color. Now, like I said, yes, they're overscale, but ultimately I'm happy with the detail. I think it helps add just a little bit extra level of realism to the overall aircraft build. Go ahead and get the pitot tube painted. This actually ended up getting knocked off during the build, so I just left it separate and installed it at the very end. Get the counterbalance weights installed onto the ailerons. This is a great little detail that one thing I was worried about is I know I'm going to have to be moving this display around because I want to take it to a couple of shows next year. And so it's one of those things that I'm kind of worried that those will easily get knocked off and lost. So I have to be mindful of that. But yeah, so we are coming to the end of this build. And if you've made it this far, I appreciate you watching. Please stay tuned for the next episodes in this series. I think it'll be worth it. And I want to give a huge shout out to my patrons for supporting this channel. I'll leave a link down below if you want to support the channel. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you on episode 2.